Seminary. He's going to be telling us about myths of the Runestone. And what I love about his approach is that it is very, very in-depth, multidisciplinary, and I think he's going to sort of explode some of the myths. And I would just like to know, how many of you have been to the Runestone Museum in Alexandria? Okay, well, we're really looking forward to your presentation. We have some technical issues we're going to work out, but in the meantime, he's going to begin telling us about his work. So welcome, thank you.
Sure, feel free to interrupt me if you have not received it yet.
Okay.
Hi everybody, thanks so much for coming out today. I'd like to begin by telling you a story. It's the summer of 1962, and a large crowd has gathered on a hillside next to Alexandria, Minnesota's Lake Winona. And this crowd has gathered to watch and participate in a history pageant. And the history pageant was dramatizing a myth. And the myth had been inspired by the discovery of a mysterious stone that had been unearthed from the field of a Swedish farmer. Later, the stone came to be known as the Kensington Runestone. And the inscription, as it was later translated and I will say also interpreted, it was interpreted to tell the story of a group of Christian Norsemen, or Christian Vikings, as some said, who traveled to Minnesota in the year 1362 and were killed by Native Americans. So let me open with a scene or two from the Runestone pageant play of 1962. The Vikings entered the amphitheater after disembarking from a dragon-shaped boat, specially constructed for the pageant. Knudsen, the leader of this imagined expedition to Minnesota, cautiously leads his men to the shore and declares, "No hostile Skraelings as far as the eye can reach, but hidden somewhere in these woodlands is the enemy." Knudsen drops to his knee and gives thanks to God. Professor Holand, the tireless promoter of the Runestones through a large portion of the 20th century, explains to the student who was before him that they were going to narrate the ensuing events. The Vikings, Holand explains, were unable to find their missing countrymen. Not seeing any Skraelings either, the expedition was lulled into guardless security. 20 of the group took a day of leisure to fish on a nearby lake and left 10 behind to guard the encampment. As the 20 came home that night, they were greeted with a, quote, ghastly silence, unquote. And at that moment, they saw their butchered comrades, the scene of which the Runestone froze in stone for all time, said Holand. "Good God, you mean the 10 men red with blood and dead?" exclaimed Holand. "Why, yes, the scene of the Kensington Runestone testifies to that. The dead Vikings lay sprawled out on the stage, and Knudsen commands his men to bury the dead. A scout returns to the camp and warns that an army of savages has amassed to the west. 'Every man to his ship,' proclaims Knudsen as the Vikings scurry in a hasty retreat. And as they depart, Norse goddesses riding real horses rush through the audience and onto the stage to retrieve the slain Viking bodies. The scene is choreographed to Richard Wagner's Ride of the Valkyries. In the final episode, Professor Holand stands in front of the stage curtain and declares the veracity of the Kensington Runestone. Like the Rock of Gibraltar, like the Liberty Bell or the pyramids, it forever attests the historic truth that Norwegians and Swedes are the true discoverers of America, not Christopher Columbus. The student asks the professor why the history books have not been revised to reflect this truth. And Holand answers, "The academics, in their isolated ivory towers, hold back historic truths. But lad, truth will win out." Dazzled by the wisdom of his teacher, the student declares, "To you, Professor Holand, will go the immortal honor of revealing that truth." As Holand and the student exit the stage, the curtain opens slowly to reveal a spotlight trained on a solitary Viking carving the inscription onto a slab of stone. Standing behind him is the goddess Columbia, holding an American flag. The Norse warrior goddess Brunhilde, holding her sword and spear. To their right and left are women holding the flags of Sweden and Norway, both at tilt. The entire cast files onto the stage. The Rune master sets down his chisel, turns towards the audience, lifts his hands and proclaims, "This eternal monument to you, valiant companions, Swedes and Norwegians who died in this paradise lakeland wilderness for Christ in 1362. The pageant ends with the organist playing, with all stops out, "America the Beautiful." The stage is bathed in red, white, and blue lights. The Kensington Runestone pageant of 1962 represents perhaps the fullest cultural blossoming of a collection of myths that emerged in response to the discovery of a stone in Omen's field. So let's go back to tell a little bit about that story in case you're not familiar with how it came about. In 1898, as the story is typically told, Olaf Omen, a Swedish immigrant farmer in Douglas County, Minnesota, near the village named Kensington, claims that he found a slab of stone entangled in the roots of an aspen tree. He was pulling out the tree to expand his agricultural enterprise. And on the stone was a mysterious inscription. The inscription was later translated into the following. And just so we can all have a sense of what it is, I'll read it for you. This is Eric Waldron's translation from 1962, and I think it's fairly faithful to the actual translation. 8 Swedes and 22 Norwegians on an exploration journey from Vinland westward. We had our camp by 2 rocky islets, one day's journey north of the stone. We were out fishing one day, and when we came home, we found 10 men, red with blood and dead. AVM, save us from evil. We had 10 men by the sea to look after our ships, 14 days journey north, 14 days journey from this island, year 1362. So initially, the stone was brought to researchers at universities, and these initial observations concluded that the stone was a creation of the 19th century. So Omen took the stone, and as the legend has it, placed the stone as a stepping stone into one of his barns in his yard, and there the stone lay in obscurity. This is Holland's retelling of the story. The stone lay in obscurity for several years, until in 1907, a Norwegian immigrant writer by the name of Hjalmar Holand travels by Douglas County, and he claims that he had not known about the Kensington Runestone before in his autobiography, but there are many reasons to be suspicious of that. Because within a few months after visiting Omen at his farm and acquiring the stone from Omen under contested circumstances, there was debates. Holand claimed that Omen had given him the stone in perpetuity for research, but Omen tells a different story, that he had simply loaned it to him for a period of time. So there's been a great debate over time about which story is right. So for Holand at that time, immediately within months, incorporated the story of primordial Viking explorers to Minnesota. He incorporated that story into his history of immigrant Norwegians in the upper Midwest. It functioned as a type of a prologue to his story, to his history of immigration. So you can see that Holand found the perfect spot to incorporate this story that he claims he just stumbled upon. But anyway, however Holand acquired the stone from Oman, he began a decades-long crusade to prove this stone was what it claimed to be. He wrote dozens of articles, several books. He was a tireless advocate and promoter. And he put forth several pieces of evidence. He found boulders in the landscape that had chiseled out holes. And he theorized that these boulders were actually chiseled out by medieval Norsemen who had come here and had drilled them out and put anchor bolts to anchor their ships as they traversed the Minnesota wilderness. And Swedish farmers throughout Minnesota came to him with a variety of implements, swords and spears and fire steels and other tools, and Holand interpreted them all as evidence, further evidence, corroborative evidence that these Vikings had actually been there. So he collected all these pieces of evidence. Many of these pieces of evidence have been long debunked as authentic evidence of 14th century Vikings. Tom Trow demonstrated that many of these boulders were drilled out, some for surveyor's markings, some for anchoring fish traps, some for holding a piece of dynamite to destroy them, to be used for foundations of buildings. Many of the artifacts that were uncovered were not indeed artifacts from the 14th century, but were artifacts created in the 19th century. But yet, despite the lack of evidence that Holand was able to gather, he was still able to persuade scores of Minnesotans that the stone was authentic and that the story was true. So much so that by 1960, some 60% of Minnesotans believed that Vikings were the first Europeans to travel to what is now Minnesota. How did he do it? I think the key, and this is what my book primarily teases out, is how, in spite of the lack of evidence, he was able to use the power of myth to capture the imagination. I think it's critical to take a look at Holand's writings as a work of collective memory rather than history. He embedded his evidence, or lack thereof, in a lively narrative. He found a document in an archive where that indicated that the King of Sweden had commissioned a group of Norsemen to go to Greenland to pursue some missing settlers who were rumored and feared to have abandoned the Christian faith and had somehow escaped to the westward wilderness in Finland. And this commission had a holy mission, as Holand sometimes referred to it as, to pursue these missing Norse Christian colonists who had disappeared. So this narrative held tremendous power for a variety of groups. So it had this power to persuade, and even if the science itself was not valid, the story itself contained a tremendous amount of truth for the people who believed in it. A French sociologist, Daniel Leger, has done some writing on the meaning of science and religion, and I think he has an important insight. He says that science is limited in its ability to satisfy human longings. We can have new scientific advances, we can have new peer-reviewed historical research, but yet sometimes science does not answer deep human longings for myth and a desire to find meaning and to inscribe themselves in the landscape. So today, the book Myths of the Runestone is not a book focusing on, is it authentic, is it not? Although, if you read it, it's fairly obvious where I lean. But the important part of the story is how the Kensington Runestone can be seen as a prism through which to learn a great deal about the hopes, the desires, and the aspirations of Minnesota, of Minnesotans throughout the 20th century. And I'll walk through 5 of them quickly. First, the ethnic piece. Ole Rovod, famous Norwegian immigrant novelist in Minnesota history. The appeal of this story among immigrant Scandinavians is obvious. It rooted these impoverished newcomers who were facing tremendous environmental challenges in farming a land that was strange to them. It helped to root them into the landscape, to prove that they truly belonged, that they were a part of the American story. And the notion that their ancestors had come before gave them great hope and inspiration in that time. On one level, this is a hopeful story, a story of an immigrant group trying to make their place and to fit into the dominant society. But there was an underside to the story as well. Hjalmar Holand offered as another piece of evidence that Vikings had been, that Norse had been to Minnesota prior to Columbus by appealing to and reminding folks about the existence of the Mandan Indians in the Dakotas, who had blonde hair and blue eyes. This anthropological curiosity inspired all kinds of imaginative speculations throughout the centuries. What were these descendants of the Welsh king Madoc? Were they other European explorers? But Holand was convinced that the Mandan Indians were the descendants of the Norse survivors of the expedition that came to Minnesota. And as Holand talks about the Mandan Indians, he says that these Mandan Indians were exceptional Indians. They were not just your run-of-the-mill Indians. These were extra intelligent. These Indians had complex culture. They had cleaner and nicer dwellings and homes. They were super Indians. And why were they super Indians? Because they have Scandinavian blood in them. That's how they got to be so exceptional. So we can see an example of a marginalized immigrant group turning around and finding another group to define themselves against. I'll talk a little bit more about race towards the end. But number 2, commemoration. The Kensington Runestone also plays an important role in how Minnesotans have made sense of living in a land that was once occupied by someone else. There's an interesting coincidence between the dates on the Kensington Runestone and one of the most traumatic events in Minnesota history. In 1862, conflict broke out on the Minnesota frontier. Dakota people had been relegated to a narrow, resource-deprived strip of land along the Minnesota River. This was the height of the American Civil War, and the federal government delayed their payment of annuities to the tribes that were owed to them. And during that summer, some Dakota warriors went out into the countryside to take food for themselves, breaking into a government warehouse. And over a period of several weeks, a few hundred white settlers were killed. And large portions of the Minnesota frontier were abandoned of settlers, and many of them were never to return. there was a lot of suffering during this event, but it wasn't just by whites. Within a few months, 38 men, Dakota men, had been executed. They had been put on trial in front of a military tribunal. Some of the trials lasted as little as 5 minutes, and 38 were executed. But many white Minnesotans were not satisfied with the fact that only 38 were executed. 400 were actually sentenced to death. And within weeks, Dakota people from around the state were rounded up, sent to a military encampment, and by the next spring, they were sent on ships out to desolate reservations in Dakota, in the Dakota Territory, and were exiled from the state, removed from the state. I think the Kensington Runestone, I would argue that the Kensington Runestone was very likely created by somebody who had the Dakota War of 1862 in mind, especially since there's the link to the date of 1362 on the inscription, 500 years apart. But for today's purposes, the reality is that Minnesotans interpreted the stone to tell a story of primordial sacrifice. If Vikings sacrificed themselves in the past, it's a comparison to, an allusion to, the white settlers who died in the 19th century. If Minnesotans could prove that Indians were just as savage 500 years ago as they were in the last few years, then it could be rationalized that they were always savage, that Indians, by their innate character, were fundamentally unable to assimilate or to be incorporated into white society, and therefore this myth, by many of the interpreters in the early 20th century, fueled a notion of white privilege and white exclusive claim to the landscape. Number 3, Main Street. Main Street. In 1920, a novelist named Sinclair Lewis wrote a book called Main Street. And in that novel, he tells a not-so-nice tale of what small-town life is like. The town he described was Gopher Prairie, Minnesota. Definitely not an appealing name of a town. But in that novel, he portrayed small-town and rural folks as backward, parochial, gossipy, anti-intellectual, uncultured. And many small-town and rural folks, understandably, took offense by that type of characterization. The town of Sauk Center, Sinclair Lewis's hometown, was actually quite imaginative in reinterpreting the critiques of the town. They actually said, well, he wasn't so much hating the town, he had some small critiques, but he's still writing about us and he still loves us. So Sauk Center today, you can see that it's a town that embraces his identity and his culture and his image. But there was another town about 30 miles up the road that wasn't able to benefit from the Sinclair Lewis as an important figure. Because in this town of Alexandria, they couldn't claim him as his own son, but yet they still felt the shock of the attacks that came from the belittling of their community. And in the newspapers in the 1920s, there was a rumor that went around that the Alexandria Public Library banned Main Street from the public library because the librarian thought Sinclair Lewis was talking about his town. So there was great embarrassment in the town over this whole incident. So Western Minnesotans, I think, were at a point where they felt that their cultural prestige was under attack. And that's why the Kensington Runestone provided a beacon of inspiration. If these folks could show that Alexandria, Minnesota, that Kensington, Minnesota, that region was the true birthplace of America, that could revive and uplift the status of the community as a place that's significant. I analyzed the rhetoric of the speeches. There was an attempt to build a monument near Kensington to house the Runestone and to promote the community. many of the Civic boosters said, this will rival one day the city of Philadelphia and Boston. The tourists, they're not going to go there. They're going to bypass those cities. And they're going to come to western Minnesota to see the Kensington Runestone, because it's a symbol that we are an exceptional people and an exceptional place in this exceptional nation. So the appeal of the civic value, and as we can see on this photo of a Kensington Runestone Monument fundraiser, we can see that the stone is guarded by two veterans from World War I with Olaf Oman himself at this event. And over the course of the 20th century, I think starting in the 1920s, we begin to see the Kensington Runestone and this myth emerge as a sacred civic narrative. Kind of building this notion of the region and the place as an exceptional. And even the artifact itself is often held and touched and handled as if it were a sacred artifact. If any of you have read the sociologist Emil Durkheim, he uses the term totem, which is in some circles it can be thought of as like a flag or representation. Well, the runestone itself emerged as kind of a symbol or an emblem of the region itself and was used in a variety of commercial enterprises, the Runestone Electric Association, the Viking Office Realty. These types of images began to be incorporated into the various civic and commercial aspects of the town. Number 4, Catholic. Why on earth would Catholics, German and Irish Catholics in particular, why would they take an interest in a Scandinavian stone, a rune stone, found in the field of a Swedish farmer? What on earth would they find appealing about this? Well, perhaps you might remember the inscription that I read, those letters, AVM, save us from evil. AVM. In 1909, Hjalmar Holand held a meeting at the Minnesota Historical Society, and he invited Archbishop John Ireland of St. Paul, perhaps the most famous of Catholic Minnesotans, and certainly famous around the country as an example of a Catholic leader who tried to bring Catholics into the mainstream of American life and to remind Catholics that they were truly American. So Ireland, why would he be interested in this stone? He interpreted AVM, save us from evil, as a prayer to the Blessed Mother, Ave Maria. In his mind, as he was interviewed in the St. Paul Dispatch the next day, he argued that this artifact proved that the first Christian activity, the first Christian prayer, was a prayer uttered to the Blessed Mother, a Catholic prayer in the wilderness of Minnesota. How would that be helpful to Archbishop Ireland and the Catholic Church? We have to remember that Catholics in many parts of the country were relatively persecuted. In my city of Philadelphia, Catholics were shot and killed and churches burned during the Bible riots of the 1840s. In Minnesota, they had a better social status, but still they were somewhat at the margins of political power in many parts of the state. So I think Ireland saw this runestone as an opportunity to prove that Catholics were a part of the founding narrative of the state. And he began a campaign to encourage other Catholic historians to write about this narrative, to remind Minnesota that it was founded originally as a Catholic place, even if there's all these Swedish Lutherans, Swedish Norwegian Lutherans running around here today. It was originally Catholic, a Catholic origin myth. Secondly, Ireland also saw an opportunity, I think. He had been trying for many years to reach Scandinavian Protestants. Of course, we know that Swedes and Lutherans are mostly Lutheran. I think Ireland might have seen this as an opportunity to remind these Lutherans that before the Reformation, Swedes and Norwegians were Catholic. Number 5. In the 1950s and 60s, the Kensington Runestone emerged as a symbol of the Christian faith. This is a cover of a vividly illustrated and dramatically written comic book called Mystery of the Runestone, written by a lay Catholic woman, Margaret Leitner, from Alexandria, Minnesota. In this story, tells a dramatic narrative of how these Norsemen came to North America and in search of those who were feared to have lost the faith. And throughout the rhetoric, we can see her expressed through the characters, we can see a great deal of anxiety about the Vikings losing their faith as they're out on this journey. Putting that in context, we know that the 1950s was a time of religious resurgence. Folks were, this was the time where one nation under God was brought into to the lexicon of American life. But by 1962, some of the civil religious consensus began to unravel, and there was anxiety. So the Runestone story also speaks, the myth speaks to some of these anxieties of the time. So in sum, the Kensington Runestone is a quintessentially American story. All right? You think of Joseph Smith finding golden plates in the hillside, translating those golden plates, and it was a story of a lost tribe of Israel that came across the Atlantic. This was a way of Joseph Smith and the Mormons to root themselves, again, a persecuted minority. They rooted themselves in the landscape through this narrative by extending an ancient history. Caleb Atwater, an amateur archaeologist in the 19th century, visited Indian mounds and collected artifacts from around the country, and he declared that surely these complex artifacts and these amazing structures that they had built couldn't have been done by Native Americans. Surely they're not capable. They must have been built by Egyptians, Phoenicians, and others who had come across the Atlantic. These types of notions of extending American history deeper into the past continue to be appealing to many Americans today. Perhaps rooted, I think, in an anxiety about our youth as a nation, and the anxiety that comes from living on a land that was once occupied by someone else. The Kensington Runestone reveals racial anxieties as well. This turning backwards towards a past that was a bit whiter. Turning back to a past where religious faith was perhaps a bit more fervent. I think these speak to contemporary desires about how we view religious and racial diversity today. This quest for an ancient origins, I think, often conceals the history of the actual people who we hear today. But the Runestone story itself is important. It is American, and it reveals a great deal about the larger story of American exceptionalism and how we come to terms with who we are today. Thank you very much. I have no idea what your schedule is, so I'll take questions. Yes, sir.
You're Professor Holand.
Holand, yes.
Had he prepared his history of the immigration before he encountered the Runestone?
Yeah, he'd been collecting, as I understand, he'd been collecting it for quite a few years, traveling all over the upper Midwest, Illinois, Wisconsin, Dakotas, Minnesota. So he had been working on this project for some time.
But not based on the Runestone.
No. Oh, no.
So it happenstance. He came upon the Runestone, and this would promote his book.
Well, I think he saw it as an opportunity to help, to frame the narrative in a richer way in his mind. And of course, during that time period, Scandinavian immigrants and even New England, Anglo-Saxon type folks were very fascinated by the notion of Vikings coming to North America to kind of assuage the anxieties about new immigrants, non-white immigrants coming to the U.S. So this was in the water both by East Coast elites and certainly certainly by immigrants in the Midwest who were looking for this inspiration and
Once again, what was the title of his book, and was it first published in Swedish? Or?
it was published in Norwegian. If I can I don't think I can say it in Norwegian, but it's basically a history of the Norwegian settlements, I think is how it was translated. Yeah,
And
Scott.
just one point, you cast doubt on, you seem to suggest that Holand knew about the Runestone and then used it. The truth is, he was told about the Runestone by neighbors of Olaf. You should go see Holand, he's got a stone. He went there and he offered him $5, he said no. Offered him $10, he said no. Then Oman said, you're just as poor as me. Take it, and when you're done, give it to the... He said Norwegian Historical Society. There was no such thing at the time. He basically meant the Minnesota Historical Society, and Holand didn't do that. So I think it's important to make sure that the facts are right, because Holand didn't know about it. He was told to go there. He acquired it, but what he did do, as you mentioned, is he basically convinced himself that he had solved the problem, proved its authenticity in his mind, therefore it belongs to me. And that's where he really took the left turn into the dark side.
Yeah, I mean, I think that he kind of did the family wrong in a way. But
No doubt about it.
yeah, I would agree with you on that part. Yes, go ahead.
You know, it's interesting. You read that little play in the beginning, and I certainly would agree, being a Minnesotan, that many of the points in that play are in the popular psychology. I couldn't agree more.
Yeah.
But the fact is that there's a group of people still studying the stone.
I know.
Some of them believe it's authentic, some believe it's not. But in that group, no matter which side of that equation you're on, believe almost nothing about that story. That myth that you just read is not held by the current people studying the stone, regardless of whether they think it's authentic or not. That they were Vikings, that there was necessarily this battle, that the stone was done in a rush as people were boarding these Viking ships with dragon shapes on them. All that stuff is almost certainly, at some level, false.
It's a myth.
It is a myth. So I just want to let my people in the audience know that there are elements of that myth that are certainly held. I mean, many people in this room grew up with them like I did. But almost no one who studies it today believes almost any of it.
I understand your point because I'm primarily dissecting the writings and the myth that's constructed by Holand.
Yes.
That's a part of the driving.
And it is what's in people's brains. I agree
That's right.
with you. It is sort of what's sunk into our brains that have to be kind of scrubbed a little bit here, I think.
So, but to be fair, like Alice Kehoe, who is a supporter of the authenticity of the Runestone today, she debunks much of Holland's myth of violent Indians from the past. I give her credit because I think she is trying to tell a more accurate history in many ways. I still disagree with her conclusions, but I think that many of the contemporary Runestone supporters have attempted to decouple the Runestone enthusiasm from the racism and the scapegoating. However, still, I think that it's important to continue to press and to think about why are so many Americans enchanted by the notion that the history of pre-Columbian America is made up of more than just Indians. You know, why is it that so many Americans today want to find evidence of non-native people prior to Columbus? And that's part of the drive of what I'm getting at. Even if individuals are trying to decouple it from the racist narrative, and I appreciate that. But still, it's emblematic of something that needs more reflection. There's a hand back there, then I'll come to you. Yes, sir.
Yeah, so just some comments maybe you can react to that come from the perspective of a cultural historian. And I like your approach to this a lot, and I thought about some other things one might add to it.
Yeah.
So about the coincidence of 62 in the date, the 500 years, and then connecting that to the fact that the stone appears in 1898, right? Is that correct?
That's correct.
That's right at the moment of Wounded Knee, and the moment when the famous American historian Frederick Jackson Turner declares the frontier to be over.
That's right.
And I think that there is a really interesting synergy in that sort of moment when this sort of settlers and Indians are, in a sense, seemingly coming to an end and what that means. That continues then into the 20s, and it's really interesting, the picture of the two World War I veterans with it in the 20s. World War I is this really important moment in American history in which the United States begins to see itself much more as a global nation, and a global nation very strongly connected to its European descent. That's the moment when Western civ courses start to be constituted in American universities to try to construct a canon of Europeanness. And it's really interesting the way the Swedish and Norwegian elements are kind of playing in that. And then I guess the last, which gets to this, what we're coming above here, about the fact that the 60s mark a kind of climax at some level, it seems to be, and that we're in a different relationship now to this than we were then, and how to explain that. I think it's interesting that it's right at the moment when we get the real expansion of mass education. I mean, the people in the 40s, 50s, and 60s who were engaging in this would not have had the education, particularly advanced education, that people by the 60s, 70s, 80s would have been. And the other one is the advent of television and a kind of different media environment in which these things circulate. And there does seem to be something about this pre-50, 60 moment, it's so saturated with a print culture world, the world of magazines, newspapers, books, as opposed to what would become televisual media, things like that.
Yeah, I think there was a certain spectacle nature to this whole thing. I mean, we don't see history pageants like we used to. I mean, these were a very interesting phase in American history where, you know, communities would work out their past and dramatize it together. It's a shame, really, that we don't have these types of pageants anymore to study and look at. The closing of the frontier dynamic is interesting. Masculinity and gender is a part of my analysis. I probably should have given it more attention. But I think there's also this kind of this appeal of these heroic male Vikings who fought these heroic battles in the past. And I think that the Kensington Runestone myth and the story helped to provide some entertainment in that sense, that these were exemplars of a more rugged individual. As you know, of course, as the frontier is closed, there is less, you know, overt conflict. In the workplace, men are working in office jobs and not doing physical labor and that kind of thing. So even the gender piece as well. But those are really great observations. Yeah.
I have a couple comments as well. It was interesting that you mentioned Frederick Jackson Turner, because he actually had interest in the Runestone story as well just before he passed away. So he didn't get a chance to do any writing on it, but it was interesting that he published a little article about how interested what he was in that.
If my memory serves me correctly, he basically said this was kind of an interesting episode in the American frontier, as far as I can remember. I'm sorry.
I just was more into that. But,
sure.
When you were reading about the pageant, I was reminded very strongly of a Fringe Festival play that appeared a couple years ago, or last year. And the interesting parallels and similarities there were between each of them. They both had a very strong Christian theme to them, I felt.
Oh, I did not see, I mean, I'm aware of that. I was living out of state, so I wasn't able to actually see that production, but I wasn't aware there was actually Christian themes to that.
They didn't go so far as to say them, but I definitely felt it in the course of the play. These specifics were slightly different, reflecting the change in where the Runestone story is going recently. But it was very similar in that it was very anti-Columbus story.
Sure. And I'm anti-Columbus for a whole lot of reasons, not just
We
that.
agree on that.
So, yes.
Yeah, I just wanted to thank you for your contribution, and I really, especially appreciative because I lived in Alexandria for 25 years. I raised two sons that are probably a little bit younger than you are. I don't know.
The class of 91, Jefferson.
Oh, well, you're very young. Anyway, I just really think it's fascinating
somehow I started making a couple of notes here, but I missed sort of the salient points you were making as 5 points.
Sure.
Could you just kind of summarize that
Yes.
quickly?
I basically said it's organized by my 5 chapters
Ah.
in the book. It was difficult trying to find a way to tell the story. Should it be straight chronological, this happened, this happened, this happened, or should it be completely thematic? Mine is a little bit of a hybrid of both, and it's organized in 5 ways. The first chapter is the ethnic piece. What did the stone mean for Scandinavian immigrants? How did this help to define them? The second one was the commemoration. How did this help soothe white anxieties about living on a land that they hadn't always lived on? 3 was how the runestone emerged as a civic symbol to kind of counter the attacks from Sinclair Lewis's Main Street novel. So it became a place of inspiration, story of inspiration. The 4th was the Catholic, Archbishop Ireland, the Catholic interest in the stone. And then finally, number 5 deals with how the runestone became recognized in parallel with Christianity. Like the two seem to be interlinked in the rhetoric of some of the residents of Minnesota, western Minnesota at that time, and gets into the kind of contemporary American civil religion dialogue of the era as well.
That's great, that's really helpful. And the other follow-up question is, you mentioned the 1862 and 1362 kind of coincidence there. The first time I ever read about that was in Walgreens. Are there any other citations that you have related to that, where there's been some observation made about the years?
Oh, I mean, Walgren said it. I mean, probably several other people have observed that. That seems fishy to a lot of people, I think.
Yeah, I know it came up to some degree when there was a series of articles that won awards in the Star Tribune about the 1862 Dakota conflict.
Sure.
And so there started to be some discussion about that then. And the only place I could find any reference to it in the literature was Eric Morgan's book. So I just wondered, and I would be interested to know more about that.
Yeah, chapter 2 gives a lot of details about
Okay.
what it meant, the
Thank you.
commemoration. Go to Scott first, go ahead.
Just real quick,
Sure.
I think we have to keep in mind, I think there's a myth within a myth here about this whole 1862, 1362 connection with natives. The stone says, 10 men red with blood and death. And there's an automatic assumption by people that there was a conflict with natives.
That's
Yet
right.
it doesn't say one word about that in the inscription.
Exactly.
So to start to make, I mean, your whole point about this connection with natives doesn't even have a platform, but yet people build something on a platform that doesn't exist, that somehow there's a connection with natives, when the runestone doesn't say anything about natives.
You are 100% right that it does not. However, folks who interpret it, and I particularly draw attention to the writings of Constant Larson, who wrote the history of Douglas County, he wrote it in 1916.
1916, I had a copy.
Yeah, me too. And clearly in the language, as I read his language, he, tells the runestone story, again, as a prologue to the history of Douglas County. It's kind of like, this is what, happened. It's very story. This is what the stone says. Exactly. But when you read his language, there's a very clear, I would argue, kind of like a scapegoating mechanism happening there, as I see his language when he talks about the savages of the Dakota War, and then he says the savages during when the Norsemen came to Minnesota. It's this constant language, and there were other terms as well that are shared between both narratives. And as I read it, it feels strongly to me that he was reading, he saw the two linked together. It's like he wanted to tie them together. But you're absolutely right. It says AVM, save us from evil. It says nothing. There was one contemporary enthusiast, I forget his name, Scott, I think you know his name. He thought that perhaps they would have died from the bubonic plague or something like that.
Yeah, there are a number of people.
A number of people who have offered those types of things. But still, the way that it has been interpreted is instructive for Minnesota imagination in the 20th century.
Yeah. But there's another myth for you.
Yeah.
What is the status of the myth in contemporary Sweden or Norway? Does it exist?
Oh, think, from what I understand, I haven't done virtually no research on that question. It's very interesting. But my understanding is they view it as really, a curiosity, and they're interested in reading and learning about the story. I think most of the Scandinavian scholars in Scotland know better than I do. Most of them have been pretty uniformly pessimistic about the runestone being authentic. Henrik Williams, for example, from Uppsala University, is a runic language specialist. He's pretty confident that the runic inscription indicates that it was not from the 14th century. I know Scott would vehemently disagree with me. Richard Nielsen, who's a very, very careful scholar as well, he would disagree with that as well. So the authenticity questions keep coming back. But there's more to the story than the authenticity. There's another hand back there?
Yeah. So, listening to your talk, I think you probably just wanted to avoid, whether this is true or not, just telling us how this myth, propagated within people, how people get to believe it, or how it got a foothold or something. But I was just wondering actually more about, if you think that someone kind of made that up, I think specifically when you were referring to the wars, the Dakota wars, you were saying that probably they needed to create something like that. Who did that, do you think? Do you think like farmers did that? Could they have done that? And then, I'm just asking this, I'm not in Minnesota, I'm not an American, this is the first time I've been hearing about this, so it's just very interesting to me. And I think what we're saying about how it got propagated and how it got a foothold, it makes sense to me that people would want to do that. But then I'm thinking, specifically when we're talking about the Catholic priest trying to interpret that AVM, have people, thought about what that AVM means?
Well, there's been a lot of disagreement about it. In particular, Johannes Holvik argued that it was actually not AVM, but AUM. You know how Latin inscriptions sometimes have the UV thing? He argued that Oman had a journal or something like that. Well, let me put it in context. In the 1890s, there was this new American fascination with the religious other, right? You've got this kind of like World Parliament of Religions in 1893 in Chicago, this new fascination and curiosity. So there's a lot of popular literature around kind of talking about these new religions that were being discovered, so to speak, by Americans. And in one writing, and Holvik makes this argument, I haven't looked into his notes in any great depth, but he claims that Oman had a newspaper article, or one of his neighbors did, that had a phrase Om, or Om, like A-U-M, and it's supposed to stand for like Om, like a meditation, Buddhist meditation. So
He did have that article.
What's that?
He did have that article.
So Oman
He
did.
did. It's
Okay.
a fact. He did have that article.
Thank you.
Oman did.
Yeah.
It's
Okay.
a fact.
So he had it. All right. So Holvik interpreted that to mean as well. This is what Oman was doing. He was playing a trick by saying, "Om, save us from evil," kind of thing. Now the Freemasons, and Scott would know a lot more about this than I do. The Freemasons also took an interest in that symbol and the letters AVM. And Scott, that they interpreted that as, remind me.
Well, it could be consistent with a belief in a Gnostic take on that. Okay, let's put it that. Let's just leave it at that.
All right, so a lot of different groups interpreted those letters in various ways. Right? Any other questions?
Is there one more question? I think, go ahead.
Did you find anything about how Canadian culture and society, if they had any interest in the runestone as well?
Probably because of geographically. There are purported Norse artifacts that were found in Ontario and several other places. I haven't really researched them, so all I can really tell you is what I've discovered in this very local story with American implications.
Well, this has been a fascinating story, and I appreciate the delicate way that you have dealt with many different people's perspectives on this and the larger story that you've pulled from it. We have books for sale. Peter will facilitate, $15. Many different forms of payment are available. I'm guessing that you would be willing to sign perhaps.
I'd be delighted.
Okay, so let's thank our speaker and
Feel free to visit the website mythsoftherunestone.com. I'll be continuing to add new parts of the story. So contribute something to me and I'll be happy to